keep chatting, but I'm gonna dip out here for a second.
It's always fascinating watching other people work on their computers.
I know, it's very awkward when I do this. But I've discovered I can't turn my camera on fast enough and push the button at the same time. So Scott, I don't know if there's any really fun historical tidbits you want to hit on, but I say let's go for that at the end. And if you wanted to say anything about your podcast,
Sure.
you can plug that at the end.
Yeah, plug them all you want.
That part I didn't. It's funny. I never remember I do that until I have to do it.
I'll make sure you get prompted to do so. Out of coffee.
You've got great lighting in that room, though.
Here?
Yeah.
That's a camera. It's the camera. I got one of these Razer cameras, R-A-Z-E-R. It is really an exceptional piece of equipment, and they have a microphone that goes with it that is equally as good.
Wow.
Well, I had to, because she got me into this coffee with Doc thing, so I had to get some decent equipment, you know.
Yeah. This is what happens. You just set me up and make me look good.
She's a slave driver.
Well, if we're going to make this.
I actually just got the agenda done for next week's board meeting.
All right. Are we good to go?
I believe we are. We're not live yet.
No, I know, but I thought I'd give fair warning. Okay, big smiles. Here we go.
Okay.
And buttons. And hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Happy Friday. Finally, 2021. We are back in our coffee seats and ready to kick this year off. So it is with great pleasure that we are welcoming Scot Phelps today. Not only a great EMS educator and historian, but a museum supporter. And so thank you so much for joining us today and for all your support over the last year. It's really made a difference to some of the programs we're doing. So thank you, thank you. I'm sure Doc has lots to dive into, so I am going to dip off and I will let you take it away.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. And Scott, thanks for joining us. I'm glad you took some time out of your day to spend some time reminiscing, etc.
It's laundry day, so it was my pleasure.
Great. We were talking a little while ago. Go back and tell me how you got into EMS.
Well, I was 15 years old and I grew up in New Jersey, which at the time, and even today to some extent, is had lots of volunteer rescue squads. And one of my friends, who was maybe a year older than me, rode by on his moped. That's how old he was. So young, he couldn't drive, but he had a moped. And the jacket looked cool. And so I joined the Vendor and First Aid and Rescue Squad. And at the time, the New Jersey didn't use EMT as the only training program. They had their own internal training program based on the Red Cross called 5 Points. So I took that at 15, and then at 16 became an EMT. And then by the time I would turn 19, I was a paramedic. And now 33 years later, I'm still a paramedic, and I've come full circle. So I actually teach the program that I took 33 years ago.
That's very cool. That's great circle history. All right.
Yeah.
So you were a MICU medic. I think a lot of people out there don't quite understand how paramedics evolved in New Jersey, which was very different from the rest of the country. Tell us a little bit about the MICUs and where they were based and how they operated.
So New Jersey started off in the first pre-hospital advanced care began in 1968 with physician staff mobile coronary care units. So in 1967, maybe it was late 66, Pantridge started publishing about his experiences in Belfast running a mobile coronary care unit. And so
Let me just jump in a minute. That's Frank Pantridge. You might want
Frank
to
Pantridge.
full name so that people can look it up later on.
I just assume everybody should know who Pantridge is, right? By then.
That's surprising.
So by the next year, so St. Vincent's in New York City, where I spent the bulk of my career actually, was the first mobile coronary care unit in the United States. And then within a year, both Staten Island Hospital, Nassau County Police Department, and Martland Hospital in Newark, which later became the College of Medicine and Dentistry, and then the University of Medicine and Dentistry, all started mobile coronary care units. In Nassau County, the police department, it was police officer, ambulance attendants, but the rest of them were physician staffed. And so in New Jersey, that was the first mobile coronary care. And then in 1974, because of problems at University Hospital, it was transferred from having it be staffed by physicians and residents to having firefighter paramedics trained at Essex Community College and Martland Hospital to staff the mobile coronary care unit. And then within a year, the 1973 law that established the paramedic pilot programs, they had trained the paramedics in parallel to the Newark firefighters, but in a separate program. So the Newark firefighters are more like cardiac technicians, where at the same time, the proto paramedics, the first paramedic groups, were being educated in 1976, the first pilot program started at Overlook Hospital. So New Jersey they had a 5-year pilot program from 73 to 79, and they wanted to try a bunch of different ways to do it. So they had hospital-based paramedics, they had fire department-based paramedics in Hackensack and New Brunswick. They had third service paramedics in Elizabeth. They had volunteer paramedics where I live now in South Jersey. And they tried all different models. And they also had rescue squad based paramedics in Mercer County. And I also worked for Mercer County Lifemobile, which was the successor to that program as well. And then after 1979, they decided the model that was the best for New Jersey, for a lot of reasons, was the hospital-based career dual paramedic non-transport model. And that's literally the model we've had for 40 years here now. The other models all eventually became hospital-based. And right now, some of the medic units transport, but most of them still don't. So for example, I work in Elizabeth for Trinitas Medical Center 1 day a week, and I work with another paramedic in a non-transport paramedic unit where we respond with the Elizabeth Fire Department. And if it's a paramedic call, we go with them in the ambulance. And if it's not, we release and we become available.
Yeah, having had the opportunity to be a hospital-based medic for a period of time back in the late 70s, early 80s, what I found advantageous to that was if I wasn't out on a quick response unit supporting the BLS squad somewhere, I was in the emergency room taking care of patients and helping out there, and it was a great learning experience. Did you find the same thing?
In my career, we haven't worked in the emergency department. At Norwalk Hospital in Norwalk, Connecticut, up until maybe a few years ago, and maybe even today, they still do work in the ER between calls.
Yeah.
But in New Jersey, they typically don't. But what we do get is we get a lot more feedback. New Jersey has sort of an interesting, weird combination of our regulations are 25 to 30 years old. At the same time, the scope of care for paramedics is probably one of the best in the entire country. If you want to just look at broad metrics, every paramedic in New Jersey can do RSI. Every paramedic, there's about 60 different medications New Jersey paramedics can utilize. even with a regulatory structure that's creaky and ancient and needs to be redone, it still provides a pretty amazing level of care.
Yeah, yeah. I think the advantage that I found, aside from working in the ED when I was a hospital-based medic, was also if the hospital was doing educational programs for the doctors and nurses,
You could be there.
go in and participate in those, and some great learning experiences.
I have one of the, I've only been at Union County College for 6 months now, but one of the things that just continues to amaze me is our physician medical director, Rafi Matosian, is actually present for every didactic class and every skills class.
Wow.
You know, he's incredibly active with our program. He's also the medical director for the mobile intensive care unit. And there's just a lot more engagement, I think, most times with the medical staff and the nursing staff than I think you're seeing most other systems. I've worked in other systems in other states. I worked for Third Services in Connecticut, and I was a professor at George Washington, so I was very familiar with the Fairfax County and Arlington County EMS systems and DC EMS system. And there's just a lot more physicians engaged, I think, in New Jersey than in most other places.
That's very cool.
We also have a lot more nursing engagement. In addition to having mobile intensive care paramedics, we also have mobile intensive care nurses who also function in exactly the same role. And in some places, there's a salary differential for the nurses, but in other places there's not. And they do it because they'd much rather work in the pre-hospital setting than necessarily in the ED setting.
Interesting, interesting. Now, let me go back to some of your educational activity and so on. I'm going to get to your podcast in a few minutes, but we were talking before we went live here, we were chatting about the history of EMS and everybody having the perception that EMS is a very young profession. How about fixing that idea real quick? Give us a little background on what your knowledge is of the history of EMS in the United States.
I actually run two different Facebook pages. One is the New York City Ambulance History Project, and the other is the New Jersey Ambulance History Project. And the first one is actually an affiliate of the museum. And the more you know about the history, the more you realize that EMS is not something that's new. It's not younger than organized fire service. It's not younger than nursing. Municipal ambulances started functioning in 1869 at Bellevue. And there was actually ambulances before that in St. Louis, but organized nursing comes from the same era. Florence Nightingale was in the Crimean War and wrote her Notes on Nursing in 1859, while the organized fire service in New York City really started with the Metropolitan Fire Department law in 1865. So when in New York, it's only a 4-year difference between when the ambulances first started out of Bellevue, and that's only a 6-year difference between when the ambulances first started in Jersey City. So we are as old as nursing and the organized fire service.
Mm-hmm.
So we shouldn't have lots of excuses as to why we haven't progressed more.
Interesting. Okay, now go back and what are those two Facebook pages again, so that everybody has them?
The New York City NYC Ambulance History page and the New Jersey Ambulance History page.
Cool, cool. I think that's good references for folks because they'll see just how far back we really do go.
And there's a lot to it. We had physicians on the ambulances. We had, even after the physicians came off the ambulances, for the most part after World War II, we had ambulance attendants in Brooklyn giving morphine to patients in crashes. In San Francisco, the ambulance workers in San Francisco, the stewards, in San Francisco, they were called ambulance stewards. They carried over 30 medications with them all the way up through the 60s or the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And they gave them. They didn't have just that bag, it seems, for the occasion if a physician was on scene. They carry those medications in their first in bag, and in their documentation, in their reports, they documented that they gave it.
Yeah, it's interesting in the urban centers how advanced some of the stuff was. And then I look back in my experience in the 60s when I was a firefighter. We worked out of a Red Cross book, and hoped that and since we were talking about areas you were familiar with, we would hope that the town of Greenberg cop would show up with the station wagon that had the Stokes basket in the back and the E&J resuscitator and some splints, and we could just load
Package them up and load them
in that Stokes basket and tell them to go to White Plains Hospital.
The funny part about the first aid, about the American Red Cross Advanced First Aid book, is that we still use stuff from that book for the EMT class, because that book spent a lot more time teaching about splinting and bandaging than the EMT book does. And when you tell people, if you don't have you take out your hair traction splinter, your Sager, and you don't have your ankle hitch, how do you tie an ankle hitch? When you say, what happens if the splint is if the splint breaks somehow, how do you tie a hitch onto a long splint and make a traction splint out of it? And that's not the kind of stuff that's in the EMT book, but it is the kind of stuff that's in the Advanced First Aid book.
In the white book.
Yep, it's in the white book. I'm not sure it's in the modern Advanced First Aid book, but it's in the 1980s version of it.
That's
right?
the one. Yep. Yeah, it's amazing. The Advanced First Aid and Emergency Care was that white book course from Red Cross, and it was really an excellent textbook.
It was, and it was what was taught in New Jersey, up until the late 80s, early 90s. EMT was not that prevalent. The Advanced First Aid was more prevalent.
Yeah, in Pennsylvania, if you were trained in the Advanced First Aid and Emergency Care material and had a card, you could sort of segue over and become an EMT very quickly. And if you were an instructor, you segued over and became an EMS instructor very quickly in Pennsylvania.
Well, that's what happened in New Jersey in about 1989, 1990, as they grandfathered everybody and then just moved forward after that.
Yeah, I think Pennsylvania was a little behind that. I think we were in 72 or 73 that we finally moved over to formal EMS.
Wow, that was way earlier. That's way earlier than most places.
Yeah, well, it was, I don't know whether they got their money in 73 with the Emergency Medical Services Systems Act, but I think the Civil Defense Office in Harrisburg was looking for something to do.
So that was what they had to do.
That's what they did. But anyway.
It was funny how those 1203 and 1204 grants laid so much groundwork and then were abandoned in 1980, right?
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting. When I was doing the pod yesterday, I was talking to some of the guys that were involved and gals involved with the MRC and the CERT organizations. And apparently funding for both of those operations has pretty much dried up.
And this is what happens. Everything runs in cycles. So in 1999, we had the Nunn-Lugar-Dominici funding stream, which did an enormous amount of good work with creating education programs for chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. There was lots of really good products. Then everybody forgot about that as soon as September 11th happened, and they've reinvented the wheel, but didn't do as good of a job. And that's what you see. Like, the CERT training program is a great training program.
Yep.
And it's been translated into Spanish. It's incredibly useful. It's just long enough to give people a really decent idea about, emergency care without giving them too much.
Yeah.
But as you see, the funding's going away for it, and it's not really being taught anymore, which is a shame because it was a great curriculum. But what you will see is that the next time there's a disaster, the government will be spending hundreds of millions of dollars to reinvent that wheel all over again.
Yeah.
And no one will remember that, wait, we had a training program. It was a really good one. It was in English and in Spanish.
Yeah. Well, new set of bureaucrats have to create a new set of statutes or regulations to justify their income.
Well, it's not even so much that, it's that there's no organizational history. I was state EMS director in New Jersey for 3 years, and I was a consultant for a long time before that. And one of the things I was always amazed at was in both the private sector and the public sector, the lack of organizational history, the lack of knowing what happened 20 years before.
Mhm.
It's amazing how every time a problem comes up, they're acting as if they've never faced that problem before, when 20 years ago, they probably had almost the same problem. I just remember that there was going to be a nursing home strike in Connecticut, and I was a consultant to Connecticut Department of Public Health. And there was literally one person there who remembered that 15 years ago, they had almost the exact same thing happen and how they managed it.
Mhm.
But you see, like, as people change, as people retire, organizations don't really care about what was learned, and they don't really try to document it. And I don't really know why, because that's the value of the institution, right?
Yeah, almost sounds like that would be a really good project for you, is writing a book on the real history of EMS, where we've stubbed our toes and where we've made the right moves.
Things. Well, I try to collect old reports, and I think there's only one that I've looked for that I haven't been able to find. It was a grand jury report from the 70s. But that's one of the things that we do with the ambulance history projects is we look for these old reports,
Yeah.
and then we post them on the web. So you could see the status of volunteers in New Jersey in 1963. You can see what happened in the 1920s in New York City. They would try to form an ambulance board to make it more organized. And the nice part is that people are interested in it, but I'm not sure how much sort of they see the big picture of it always.
Mhm.
I just hope they do. That's why I did. That's why I do it, because I'm interested in it, and I think there's other people interested in it as
Yeah,
well.
yeah. Now, you got a JD degree at Brooklyn Law School.
I did.
Now, my curiosity is, what? Tell me about how you came to the decision to go for law rather than getting a doctorate or going to medical school.
Well, I had a master's degree in public health from Yale School of Medicine, and I wanted to get a terminal degree because I wanted to be a state EMS director. Even then, and I wanted to do it until I found out how much they got paid at the time, and that sort of cured me of it for 15 years.
Mhm.
And I had a choice. I could have gotten a PhD, I could have gotten an MD, or I could have gotten a JD. And I had worked for hospitals since I was 18, and by then I was in my late 20s. And I knew that that doctors didn't really respect PhDs. And so it was between an MD degree and a JD degree. And at the time I was married to an ED nurse, and she had worked while I went through school. And she just wasn't going to put up with me being a student for another 7 or 8 years. So law it was. Although in my defense, I came out of law school and passed the bar exam. And my first job out of law school was as an assistant professor of medicine at George Washington University. So I did become a lawyer who then became a medical school professor. So I guess it worked out in some ways, although I still think, the doctors got paid more than the lawyers did.
Yeah, very cool. Very cool. Where do you see us going in EMS? Say, look ahead 20 years. Tell me where we're going to be.
It depends. A friend of mine once said to me that he thought this was going to turn into a real job. And that was 20 years ago. And when you look around, there's a lot, probably the majority of EMS positions in this country are transient. They're not career positions. They don't get people to stick around. And that is actually the benefit of a degree requirement, is not necessarily the degree itself, but people who commit to a degree in paramedicine are more likely to stay in paramedicine. And that creates more political activism. So I think that, unfortunately, things have been getting worse for the past 20 years. I'm constantly amazed that 20 years ago, as a New York City hospital-based paramedic, I was probably making about $75,000 a year. And rent was half of what it is now. And health insurance was half of what it is now. And 20 years later, you see that the fire department paramedics are still making that money now.
Yep.
So the real purchasing power has been decaying. And we're not seeing any change in that. We don't see strong unionization in most places. Though, as we talked before, I live in Bordentown, but I also have an apartment in Yonkers. And Yonkers Fire Department probably has the strongest fire union of anywhere in the country. The Yonkers firefighters' starting salary is the highest in the country. Maybe Menlo Park is probably in competition with them.
Wow.
But it's because they have a strong union.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's not necessarily a panacea, but I think that some sort of organized working together to explain to people what we do, explain to them the responsibilities we have, explain to them how we're different than other first responders and other healthcare workers. And I think there's a pretty good argument for paying us a fair and living wage. And that's one big part of improving EMS. The other big part is increasing the number of middle manager positions, because one of the reasons in 2001 that EMS only got 4% of the bioterrorism dollars and 96% of the remainder went to fire and police was because we didn't have people to send to meetings. Because we have a flat employment structure almost everywhere, without those middle managers, we're just not at the table. People don't understand what we do because we don't tell them. They don't understand what we do because we're not at the meeting. And that's everywhere you go. That's in hospitals, that's in third service, fire departments that are third services, that's in separate services, that's in the private sector. We're not good at telling people what we do. And when they see it on television or they actually see it firsthand, they're amazed. Because my mantra, when I was state EMS director, I had a lot of mantras, but one of my mantras was, we're not mid-level practitioners. We're not, but we are more similar to mid-level practitioners than we are to anything else. Mm-hmm. We respond to a scene, we make an independent assessment, we formulate an independent diagnosis, we formulate and implement a treatment plan, and then we at some point usually talk to a physician. And there's no other clinicians in healthcare other than physicians, and then podiatrists, dentists, other terminal level clinicians. Other than nurse practitioners and physicians assistants, we're the only ones who function in that way. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's an argument we could be making really easily to actually give ourselves a better position from which to argue for more money and more respect, and not necessarily more autonomy, because the level of autonomy that paramedics usually have is absolutely astounding. Yeah. But just to have more recognition of what we do and how hard we work.
Yeah, point very well taken. We're sort of it's funny, and I was interested to hear what you had to say about Fidney and the medics now versus the medics 15, 20 years ago. Money hasn't changed much when it comes to the guys that were with the Health and Hospitals Corporation and then shifted over to Fidney, and they sort of got lost in the shuffle somewhere. And that is unfortunate. I agree with you.
They've worked very hard, but there's a number of part of the problem with New York City with Fidney is that anytime they want to make a clinical change, it's enormously expensive for them. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the medical care has sort of been at not a standstill,
Yeah.
but it moves very slowly. As you get to be a bigger organization and you have thousands of people to train, and it costs 6 or 7 figures to make any clinical change, it's very hard to do that.
It's staggering to see what it takes in New York City. I'm the guy that essentially helped develop the visual language translator that they carry around with them.
Hmm.
The process of getting that product into their hands. Well, Perugia walked up to me at a conference one day and he said, "I've got a grant." And that was music to my ears. And so we went to work and we had posters out in Staten Island at the Academy and said, "Okay, tell us what looks good on here," and so on. And that's how we developed the product, but it took almost 18 months.
Sure. Actually, John only
Then,
lives about 5 miles that way right now.
yeah,
John lives in Hamilton Township,
then
next
it was
town
a
over.
hell of a time to get it out to everybody and make them aware of what they had.
It's really hard.
Yeah.
And they also, one of the things about New York City that even most people at Finney EMS don't understand is they've been a uniform service since the Giuliani administration. There was a court case that was settled. They just haven't gotten the bargaining power to actually get those changes in their wages and work conditions. And listen, they were working all through COVID for the most part without appropriate PPE.
Yep.
They were, whereas the hospital-based units, because they were hospital-based and they already had a full-time emergency manager at most of those hospital systems, they had appropriate PPE.
Mm-hmm.
They were paid, the hospital medics who work in the 911 system were paid bonuses, whereas the fire department EMTs and paramedics are still making, Burger King wages. There was a New York Times article the other day about OnlyFans and people having to go to sex work in order to make a living. And they mentioned 2 separate paramedics who had to have an OnlyFans page in order to make ends meet. And one of them was a woman who works in New York City, and the other one was a woman who worked in the Midwest. But we shouldn't have a profession where people need to have a second and third and fourth job in order to pay their rent, in order to put food on their table for their kids. And, this is where I get more militant about, fair and living wages. That, I'm always shocked they ever let me be state EMS director, because you're not going to find anybody more pro medic than me. I got paid fairly as a medic, as a voluntary hospital medic. And I think everybody deserves the same. I was able to pay my rent, pay my way through college. I got paid more than the police officers and the firefighters got paid in New York City at the time.
Mm-hmm.
They had better benefits and better retirement, but I got paid more. That just isn't the same today for the Finney paramedics. It might be the same for the hospital paramedics who have experience, but I just want to see everybody be able to make a living, engage in this career, and be able to take care of their families. And it's not too much to ask that we be treated fairly.
Well, and I think part of the argument is too, and I've had a similar discussion, but not quite as militant as that. But if I've got kids working for me and they've got to have 2 or 3 other jobs just to survive, their decision-making skills on the street are going to deteriorate, and patients are going to suffer.
Sure, and that's a real problem. I mean, turnover. This was an argument in New York City last year about the cost of turnover.
Yeah.
But the problem with the cost of turnover is you don't get any clinical expertise. You don't get anybody who actually understands the lay of the land in the neighborhood you work in. If you're losing 30 to 40% of your workforce every year, for a long time that seemed to be what New York City wanted. They wanted a disposable workforce because it was cheaper. But it's not the best thing for patients. And that was actually before COVID hit. That was becoming a bigger and bigger issue for the New York City Council about retention and retaining people. over the long term, because that's what you want. You don't want somebody caring for you who's only been there for 3 months. You want somebody who's has 10 years worth of clinical experience or 20 years worth of clinical experience, and or even as we get older like us, 30 years worth of clinical experience,
Sure.
providing care for people, because there's value to that. You don't want your surgeon, you don't want to be your surgeon's first week. You want them to be good at their job.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Very good. Scott, I think we're about out of time. Anything you want to add in terms of things that I may have missed prompting you on?
Oh, listen, I love the history stuff, and I could talk about history all the time. I mean, there's so much that people can learn. There's a book, last name is Bell, is the guy who wrote it, called The Ambulance, which is probably the best book about the history of EMS. Ryan Corbett Bell, he's the one who wrote it. I also do a podcast. It's not a history podcast. It's just basically whatever strikes me that day. It's actually on the GEMS podcast network, called the Ambulance Science Podcast.
Ambulance what? I'm sorry.
The Ambulance Science Podcast.
Okay.
Where we talk about everything from COVID to OnlyFans pages to whatever sort of bugging me at the moment. There's a bunch of reasons, a bunch of political reasons about why EMS is stuck in a bunch of weird places. And I'm always interested in that stuff as well.
Very cool. I think that what's really interesting to me is the fact that you are now the paramedic program director at the place where you originally received your initial training. I thought that was a cool piece of turnaround stuff.
It's the capstone, right? So I used to, when I was state EMS director in New Jersey, I actually had a blown up photograph of my original medic card looking over me. So that 19-year-old Scott, every day I would have him looking over my shoulder, so that when I made a decision, I'd have him in mind. Like, am I doing the best thing for the patients? Am I doing the best thing for the clinicians, to move EMS forward in New Jersey?
Very cool. Very cool. Christy, are you still with us?
I am.
Now for a word from our sponsor.
No words from sponsors yet, but if you're interested in sponsoring, please give me a call. I don't know if, Scott, you have any final words on how the museum kind of plays into all of this, and what drove you to offer some support to our programs, and if there's something the museum can do to help contextualize the advancement of the career paths and EMS as a whole.
I think one of the important things, let's just talk for a second about this project about digitizing the GEMS, first 10 years of GEMS. Part of the reason this stuff is so important is that people have to know what came before them. The reason systems are screwed up is not because they started off screwed up. It's usually because decisions were made which caused them to be like that. And so part of the way for you to figure out how to change things is for you to understand why things are the way they are. And you could look at New York City, you can look at San Francisco or Los Angeles, you could look at a lot of places in the country, a lot of places in the world. And the systems today are based upon what happened before. But if we don't understand that stuff, we're not going to have the ability to actually effectively change it. And so the more we can participate and the more we can document what we've done and make it available to people so that they can both do their research, whether it's formal or informal, we're going to get better decisions in the future. And that's part of the reason why I was so interested in New York City Ambulance History Project and the New Jersey Ambulance History Project. I've worked both places most of my life. I've been engaged in both, but the reasons why and the things that happened before really do impact today in a very real way. And that's part of the reason why history is so important. And that's part of the reason why the EMS Museum is not really about what a 10-watt app core looks like. The museum is really about creating a space where you can help figure out why things are the way they are and help figure out how to make them better tomorrow.
Cool. Good comment. Very solid comment. Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
hired.
We have a tendency of repeating our own mistakes, it seems, in EMS. We're good at that. We've made the same mistake before. Let's do it again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Great.
so with that said, I'm going to say we're still raising funds for our digitization project. My, that's a tongue twister. So we've dropped a link into the feed here. We'll put it in the info at our YouTube channel. If you're able, please help us with a financial donation to that project. And we'll continue to digitize not only the GEMS magazine collection, but we have a number of other magazines and some original papers from the Roanoke Rescue Squad on up through some other papers from squads as they've been donating them over the past 10 years. So we'd like that all to be accessible as soon as possible. And of course, that's all funding dependent. So help us spread the word, donate if you can. We have another guest on for coffee tomorrow night, Steve Worth. And so I hope everybody can join us again tomorrow. It's Saturday, so you shouldn't be doing anything. You should just be able to hang out in front of the computer. And I think that's all I have from the office today. Otherwise, thank you both.
Great.
This was a great.
Thanks again for the time.
Thank you for having me, and tell Steve I said hi. He messaged me literally the other day.
Excellent.
Cool.
Will do. Thank you all. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well done.